chair this session, it is my pleasure to introduce a friend of the museum who serves on our Presidential Counselor's Advisory Board, Jason Steinhauer. Jason is a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center. He is also the founder and host of History Club on Clubhouse with more than 100,000 followers, and was the founding director of the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest at Villanova University from 2017 to 2020. A public historian with over 20 years of experience in major cultural and historical institutions in the U.S., Steinhauer is the founder of the History Communication Institute and the creator of the field of history communication, which examines how history gets communicated on the World Wide Web. His book, History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past, was just released. Thank you for being here. And Jason, over to you.
Well, hello, everyone. It's great to see you out there in cyberspace. And thank you to the National World War II Museum for having me as part of this conversation. As Jeremy mentioned, I'm on the Presidential Counselors of the World War II Museum. It's a wonderful institution I care very much about, and an institution that thinks a lot about not only history, but the future of history. What the future of history communication will be, what the future of history education will be, and how we are going to continue to learn about history, as well as where historical information and misinformation will reside in the future. And I feel like it's in that spirit that we have this conversation today about video games and World War II history in video games. This is a subject that ties past, present, and future. Not only the past in terms of World War II history, but also the history of video games themselves, which has been around now for 25, 30, 40 years. The present, obviously, it's a huge industry right now with billions of players worldwide. And the future. How much will this industry grow, and how much of a role will it play in shaping our understanding of World War II, history of World War II, memory of World War II, narratives about World War II. So we've got an excellent panel today, depending on where you are in the world, to talk about this. Some amazing experts, not only in the video game industry, but also in historical interpretation, historical analysis. Far more expertise than I have on this subject, so I'm excited to learn along with them and contribute where I can. So let's start out just by doing really quick introductions so that we know who everyone is. And then I'll ask each panelist to take a few minutes just to tell us where he sits in this conversation and from what perspective he'll be coming into this conversation from. So I'm just going to go in the order that I see you on my screen, first of all. So Bob, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone real quick?
Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Whitaker. I'm a history professor at Collin College, which is a community college in Dallas-Fort Worth. And I also run, in my spare time, a YouTube series called History Respawned that features historians and other humanities scholars discussing historical content in video games, games such as Assassin's Creed, Sid Meier's Civilization, Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, you name it.
And if you're listening out there and you're not familiar with some of those games, we will get into what they are and what types of games they are and who plays them and what they do and all that. So if you're already feeling like, oh, wow, I don't even know the names of those games, don't worry. We will cover it all. But next, let's just have Peter introduce himself real quick. Tell us a little bit about where he's coming into this conversation from.
Yeah, hi. I'm Peter Hirschmann. I am a game director at Respawn Entertainment, which is part of Electronic Arts. I'm in Los Angeles, yeah, I've been I've been lucky enough to be part of the Medal of Honor franchise for a number of years, going back to the original one, and then the one we just shipped, Medal of Honor Above and Beyond. I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Nick, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about who you are.
Greetings all. I am Nicholas Moran. I am a full-time employee of Wargaming.net. We have a couple of flagship games, World of Tanks and World of Warships, amongst others. I also run a sideline YouTube channel as well, The Chieftain, where I do tank history, which also leverages my military career. People think I'm a historian for wargaming. I'm actually not. It's more of a combination of business relations, museum relations, and teaching history, but we can get to that as we keep going.
Excellent. Yes, we will get into all that. And apparently, according to the mug behind you, you're also the best dad ever. So congratulations on that. So let's get you each to talk a little bit about your work, just very generally, because again, for some people listening and watching, some of this may already not be very familiar terrain. They may not be familiar with Medal of Honor, for example. They may not know what that is. They may not know the difference between simulation games where you're encountering different scenarios and having to make choices versus active shooter games versus single player versus multiplayer. Also, people may not be aware of just how large this industry is, the video game industry itself, and then also this sub-industry of World War II games. So, Peter, if I may put you on the spot a little bit to talk about your work, but also maybe some of the broader context, describe some of the games, describe some of the differences between the games, describe the game that you work on, and if you're able to, maybe share a little bit about how large this universe of players is today.
Well, gaming is the game industry is larger than the film industry. It's larger, and depending on how you look at the different stratas and platforms, it is the number one form of entertainment around the globe. And when it comes to games specifically about World War II, there are as many different World War II games as there are films and books and TV series and different approaches to it. And as you alluded to, there are top-down strategy games, there's simulation games, there's arcade-oriented games. Medal of Honor series, which I've been involved with, that's in the what's called the first-person shooter genre, where you're actually looking out of the eyes of the soldier, boots on the ground, so to speak. And again, depending on the game and the year, you can find almost every aspect of World War II covered. And just as everyone who's on this in this seminar knows, something interesting happened every single day of the war. So there's no shortage of narrative material or historical material to tap into. And I think depending on how your level of a gamer, what you're interested in, you can usually find something that's gonna match your needs and match your interests. The Medal of Honor series, it was created to introduce a new generation that maybe wasn't being taught about World War II as much as earlier generations, to introduce them to just some of the basic concepts of World War II, how it started, how we got into it, where it happened. There's a lot of stuff that I think people who are familiar with the war take for granted that, isn't unfortunately taught in schools these days, or especially before Private Ryan and Band of Brothers and the Greatest Generation really re-entered popular culture. I think there had really been a dry spell in popular entertainment about World War II, and it's been great over the last 20 years to see it really reemerge and take its place in popular consciousness. And I think games have been a really important part of that.
All right. Well, I've got a lot of follow-up questions, but let's bring Nick into the equation now, and I'll come back to you on a couple things. But you talked about Medal of Honor as a sort of a shooter game. Nick, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the different types of games and how they work, again, because people may not be familiar. And then also if you could just weave in what your role is. You talked a little bit about it. You're part historical consultant, part business relations, part marketing and strategy. So talk a little bit more about how a game actually comes together and how it weaves together all of these different aspects, and then your role in that.
All right, so I'm going to start off actually with a bit of a movie tangent. So many, many moons ago, before they filmed Fury, they sent me the script and wanted me to look at it for historical accuracy. They flew me out to Pinewood and we had quite a bit of a chat. And the director had made a comment to me, which has stuck with me ever since. And it was, historical accuracy is something that will be accommodated if possible. but if necessary for the success of the overall operation, it must be sacrificed. And I thought it was an interesting adjunct to Mr. Sadusky's comment yesterday. So we have this medium available to us, and you sort of, with great power comes great responsibility. And the irony is, in order to have that great power, we have so, as was mentioned, we're so huge. You have to abdicate the responsibility, and the reason is that realism is not fun. And I say this as a player. I've sunk far too much time into high fidelity simulators like DCS, digital combat simulators for airplanes, or Steel Beasts for tanks. But they are very niche products. And even then, they don't come close to equating with reality. So, I mean, Steel Beast is good enough. I would use it to train my tank crews. It's that good. But there's not very many people who play it. And you're still, you're not sweating for 5 days in 100 degrees and then you do the shower and so on. And there's always the boring stuff like logistics. So even at the high end, the high fidelity level of a video game, which teaches you a lot about a lot of mechanics, there always has to be some sacrifice made to make it appealing to somebody to actually want to play it in the first place. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, more or less, are my company's games like World of Tanks. It is not a hyper-realistic game. In fact, it's barely realistic at all, but it is fun and it is accessible. And the purpose, primary purpose is got to get people to play it. And with the assets that you get from having players, you can do other things. So our position with history is actually you don't learn history from the game, but you learn history outside the game and in association with it. And that's where I start working with museums and so on, because we're trying to. It's like a sponsorship, basically. We scratch their back, they scratch us. And by way of example, there was a letter put out by the director of the Duchess Panzer Museum many moons ago, and we wanted to host a player event at their museum. And that's like a little mini convention that folks get together. And the letter was addressed to the supporters of the museum and was written to explain to the museum why they were opening the doors to a company which made a game which depicted war as a complete antithesis of what the museum was trying to teach. Because the game is fun. There's no infantry, no blood, no horror or anything else. But the museum's position was that this enemy of their position, if we bring him in, we can teach the museum's perspective, and that way the museum gets to teach the real history, and everybody wins. We get better engaged players. We get new players. The museum gets to teach their function, and that's kind of our position. Is folks like myself, I have counterparts in the European office and other offices as well. We try to reach out to teach history not through the medium of the game, but in association with the game. And that's a position I don't think many other video game companies take. Very few times will they have historians full-time on staff. Perhaps you could tell me if I'm wrong there. But I think usually military consultants are hired and then as a contractor, then released after the game is developed.
Very interesting. Very interesting. A lot of things to follow up on there, which I've taken some notes on. But first, let me get Bob into the conversation here. Bob, you are a trained historian, PhD historian, a professor, and you also play video games, and you also analyze video games through your YouTube channel. I wonder, actually, I want you to talk about that. I also want you to talk about how you even got into that in the first place, because that may be not something that people always associate with PhD historians. So how did you get into it? And then what are you seeing from where you sit in terms of this connection between gaming, history, and how they overlap in your world, complement each other, or maybe don't complement each other?
So I started my work with video games about 10 years ago. I wrote a set of blog posts for the University of Texas site, Not Even Passed. Then that transitioned into the YouTube series. And I mean, I was fascinated from a young age with historical games. And then once getting into graduate school, learning how popular these games were in terms of dollars and cents. For instance, in the past 5 years, we've had many historical games, like Red Dead Redemption 2, Call of Duty games, Medal of Honor games. And those are games that are typically at the very top of the charts in terms of overall sales. For instance, last year's #1 game was Call of Duty Vanguard. 2017's #1 game was Call of Duty World War II, right? So, these are games that are popular. And I think 10 years ago, I was interested in looking at relationship. How are these games depicting the past, and in particular, the history of the Second World War. And my interest in history actually kind of began with games. Back in the early '90s, I was playing Sid Meier's Civilization 2, and kind of one of the features of Civ 2 was that you could create a mod, a scenario. For the game that you could then play and then share with other players. And so, what I did as a young kid and a young adolescent was I tried to create a scenario based on my grandfather's tales about being a hump pilot during the Second World War. These are American Army aviators who flew over the eastern Himalaya mountains to drop supplies to Chinese nationalists during the Second World War. And so I would listen to him, and then I would go and look at the history books and kind of try to make an accurate simulation of being a hump pilot in World War II. And all through the '90s, I was playing games like Panzer General. I was playing first-person shooters like Medal of Honor, like Call of Duty, and not yet thinking about the relationship between those games and popular memory, public memory of the past. But definitely by the time I got to graduate school, and I was encountering students in my classrooms, they would come up and they would bring up these historical games to me, asking, like, oh, I was just playing this most recent Call of Duty game based in World War II, and I had a question about the Battle of the Bulge, right? And not basing that question off of lectures or history books, but basing it off of a game that they had just played. And so my work on the YouTube series History Respawn is to try to put scholars in that space of gaming culture to answer those types of questions regarding the ways that games present the past, and in particular how they present the Second World War. And I think this conference comes at a really opportune moment because the long history of World War II games has been kind of, I would say, narrowly focused on the experience of North American soldiers, North American troops, a lot on D-Day, a lot on the Western Front. But now, in the last 10 years, that's really changed quite a bit. And some of that's happened at the AAA level, big budget games like Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, but also with independent games coming from independent studios. So I'm really eager to talk about that as well.
Yeah, folks may not be aware that there are not only games related to World War II, beach storming, or murdering or killing Nazis, but there are also Holocaust video games. You can simulate being part of the Warsaw Uprising. There are a whole range of different games. There's a game that I found just doing some quick Googling the other night about being a member of the French Resistance. There's a game that you can play being a member of the Dutch Resistance. There's a game about a Belgian farmhouse during World War II based on personal narratives and personal memories. So to the point that was made earlier, World War II offers such a rich panoply of stories to mine and situations to simulate that it sort of lends itself to this vast universe of game creation that we're now seeing across the world. But Bob, if I can, I want to stay with you because this question about accuracy that was brought up for Nick, I think ties to this question of questions that students have. And so I want to pull on that thread a little bit more. From where you sit as a professor, how do you see this question of accuracy in games? And then I'll let Nick and Peter respond. But do you find yourself having to correct things that people have learned from games, particularly younger students? Do you find that there are certain things the games do well in terms of spurring historical questioning and historical thinking, but other things that maybe they don't do well? What's been your experience in this terrain?
Well, I find that there's a lot of expectations that are placed on historical games that maybe aren't needed or aren't useful. I think a game's first job, as Nicholas was saying, is game's first job is to be fun. And if the game is not fun, people are not going to play it. So you can have, this incredibly accurate simulation of the past, put all these pedantic details in there, make sure that your tank has got the right number of rivets, number of bullets, etc. But if it's not fun, people are not going to care. And so I think that, game developers' job is to make fun games. And this expectation or this worry that games are not accurate, this is a worry that we have as historians with historical novels. This is a worry we have with historical films and TV shows, even some documentaries. And so, my position has always been we should look at games in the same sort of way. Do we rake these other mediums over the coal for not having historically accurate depictions? Not usually. And so why do we do it with games? And in terms of accuracy, I'm in the business as a professor of answering questions. So I always attempt to answer student questions as best I can, questions on YouTube as best I can, and doing so as truthfully and accurately as possible. But I think that the main use for games, historical games, is that they encourage historical literacy and they encourage historical interest, maybe in a way that even professors or history textbooks can't. It's very often the case students will be turned off by traditional history instruction lecture format, but they'll find an interest in the Second World War or some other historical event through a game. And so my job, as I see it, with regards to History Respawned and YouTube, is to try to encourage that interest, to encourage them to look deeper into that history and what scholars have to say about it.
Peter, I want to bring you back in here now on this question about accuracy from a game developer standpoint, from someone who's in the industry. What aspects do you feel like you have to be accurate on when it comes to these World War II games? Do you want to make sure you get the weapons accurate, the uniforms accurate? Do you want to make sure that the settings that the games are happening in are as accurate as possible based on photographs or depictions that have been written down in diaries? And what areas do you feel like are less important for you to be accurate on and where you have more creative leeway and creative freedom?
Well, first, as I see myself on screen, I want to apologize for the inaccurate depiction of my hair coming through with this filter. I'm so sorry. First, I want to say, though, it's so delightful to hear what Bob is saying about his students using what they saw in games or being prompted by what they saw in games to ask questions and to dive deeper. And I think that's always the dream. Because we are making entertainment. We are, to the points that Nick and Bob have been making. The goal is, and again, I don't want to cast so wide a net covers everything. But for at least the games I've been involved with, it is to be entertaining. For the Medal of Honor series, it's always been about how do we be authentic. Realism in a game is challenging because in real life if you get hit by a bullet or two bullets, or God forbid 3, you're probably out. In a game, that's a few seconds. That happens every few seconds. So there's already the context of which you're experiencing the story is patently unrealistic. But you want to be authentic. And the example I'll give is, a lot of the Medal of Honor games were in the European theater. And we used to talk about on the team that the Third Reich was incredibly scary. They're the best equipped, best trained, most evil fighting force that was on the planet. You don't need to give them jetpacks. You don't need to give them mecha suits or anything like that. If you just follow what really happened and interpret that and translate that into gameplay and interactivity, that's what gets you to a authentic and therefore more powerful experience. I think when you start to embellish, if you have to embellish what the Third Reich was capable of, you're reading the wrong history books. So games are incredibly unrealistic, but if you can get to a level where they at least feel authentic, then you've hit that sweet spot. And then, as Bob was saying, if you can make it then be a gateway into actual scholarship or learning more or asking questions, that's the goal. And then to take a class or go to a museum, or best of all, seek out someone, seek out a veteran or someone who's actually there. That I think is when the games are delivering on their promise, is acting as that gateway into learn what's the real story, what actually happened. And I think that's the sweet spot you want to hit.
Nick, I want to come back to you. You already touched on this question of accuracy a little bit, the quote from the filmmaker, which I appreciate you bringing to the table here. But it seems to me that there is some responsibility for accuracy, even if it will often or sometimes get sacrificed to make sure that the game is entertaining enough. I mean, you're not going to, for example, create fake uniforms that GIs didn't actually wear. You're not going to integrate weapons into the game that the GIs didn't actually use. So where's the balance there? Where's the line?
As much as you can afford it. I think we probably want a sort of a Hippocratic sort of attitude, like first, do no harm. And there's a difference between, shall we say, a sin of omission and a sin of error. So, for example, abstracted lines of supply. So most war games, like hex-based war games, will give you a zone of control, and you have to trace a line of supply. And it's purely, brain fart, conceptualized. It doesn't matter to the purposes of the game whether or not the American line of supply is 2 guys with CCKW Deuce-and-a-halfs, or if the German line of supply is 100 guys with horses and carts. It has an effect. But that's not something they have to unlearn, because there's no false information being put in. But on the other hand, if you put false information into the game, like let's say a Panzer battalion can reconstitute as quickly as a US tank battalion, or German units get a night fighting bonus against British units because the Germans had this famous night vision gear in their tanks, which didn't actually work. That becomes an active misconception that would then need to be untaught to fix it later on. So as long as it doesn't cost anything to get it right, get it right. If it costs something, get it right, just don't get it wrong. And I think that's the important thing. The other thing I just want to mention, going back to an earlier point on the reality or the realism, is net effect. So if you look, this is something we do in the Army with our simulations, is you don't look behind the curtain, because what's going on has absolutely no bearing whatsoever to reality. But if the end effect is correct, it doesn't matter if your rifle has the wrong rate of fire, or if you got the wrong range on the artillery piece or whatever. If it has a net effect, you can learn good lessons for it. And the advantage that a video game, especially a serious game, like, for example, my professor, I'm taking military history master's, used combat mission. And a video game is interactive. It allows you to ask, what if? Why do I do this? Why should that not happen? And you will learn more experientially than you will by just watching a video or listening to a lecture or reading a book. So if you can have that interactive ability with the correct outcome after the curtain thing has been done, then you got a winner.
Okay, so you've each made a convincing case about why video games are effective tools for at least learning something about World War II as maybe a gateway into further exploration of World War II, as a complement to maybe scholarship or what happens in the classroom. And I think that's great to put that perspective out there. But now I want to challenge and push you each a little bit to be able to see the other side. Because I think we wouldn't be doing justice to this conversation, this panel, if at least we didn't consider the effects that these games may or may not have on public memory writ large, and whether or not that positively or perhaps negatively contributes to public understandings of the war. Because that is really the spirit of this conference, to have these kinds of debates and ask these tough questions of ourselves. So let me first go back to Bob as, again, an instructor or someone who's in the classroom. I wonder, we're kind of thinking about these games through a allied centric perspective, right? You're the good guy. You're the liberator. You're the soldier that lands on Normandy Beach, and so it's okay if you go through these various simulations where you kill Nazis, because everyone can agree that killing Nazis is a good thing. Okay, so what about video games that are from the Nazi perspective, where the Nazis are killing US soldiers? I don't know if these exist, but I imagine they do. And if they haven't, they probably will exist. Uh, is that equally good? Is that an equally good gateway into history? Or is that problematic? And does that lead to problematic understandings and memories of World War II?
Okay, I guess I get to play the bad guy here for a moment. I've actually taken a moment to list out 5 or so reasons that I think we could have a bit of an issue with the ways in which games depict the Second World War. The first one I kind of listed off in my introduction is that, these are games that are typically made by North American developers for a North American audience. So it tends to have a extreme focus on America or English-speaking countries and allies during the war, to the detriment of just about anybody else. And when it comes to that Allied depiction, there's a lot on the heroism from D-Day, heroism involved in fighting on the Western Front. But there's not many moments where you've got, a look at questionable Allied decisions, whether that is the use of the atomic bomb against Japan, or the aerial bombardment campaign in Western Europe. In addition, with World War II games, up until very recently, talking the past 5 years or so, up until very recently, very few of these games mentioned the Holocaust. That's a big point of emphasis, big fear amongst historians is kind of a lacking general knowledge of the Holocaust, Holocaust history. And Jason, you mentioned that the Nazis make a great enemy, right? A great enemy to go after in these games. But what you don't often see in these World War II games is any kind of understanding or presentation as to why the Nazis are evil. It's kind of assumed that the player might have that knowledge already. And another disturbing thing about history World War II games, especially grand strategy games, say something like Hearts of Iron by Paradox, maybe some of the older games, from the era in the 1990s, Panzer General, is that they present a view of Germany that is including kind of what historians would call the version of the clean Wehrmacht, right? This idea that the German army was somehow separate from the Nazi state and not a direct participant in some of the atrocities that were committed during that era. And so those are kind of issues related to the way that the developers have created World War II games, but there's also, of course, with video games, interactive elements, right? The players are interacting with the narrative, but then through modifications, mods on PC, they can actually create their own scenarios using the technology of the game to pursue their own interests in the past. And what we see in a lot of grand strategy games, again, is this kind of template of modifications being used to pursue racist alternate histories of the past. And again, I don't mean to point out Paradox here, but their series Hearts of Iron is very popular for this, where you've got player-made modifications that depict things like the successful assassination of FDR in America during the Second World War and the reestablishment of the Confederate States of America during World War II. And then, of course, with kind of players' role in the world of World War II video games, there's also kind of outrageous elements of gaming culture that often appears in these types of games. So, for instance, the Call of Duty series is famous now for including their World War II games a zombie mode where you can kill Nazi zombies. And in addition, in their multiplayer modes, they include a lot of pop culture avatars, which can kind of make a mockery of the serious setting for these World War II games. So, for instance, Call of Duty Vanguard, most famous kind of popular game from last year, set in World War II. They just announced that they have a new multiplayer pack of avatars that you can play in a World War II setting that includes the avatar of the rapper Snoop Dogg. So Snoop Dogg can participate in the Second World War in this multiplayer setting. So I think we had talked this morning a little bit, the panel talked about Holocaust remembrance and problems related to guests at museums taking inappropriate selfies at Holocaust sites. This kind of gamic culture element to World War II games, this is kind of the Holocaust selfie in terms of World War II games.
Good, thank you for that. Let me now bring Nick and Peter back in, and I don't necessarily need to have you respond to one thing or another, but I just, obviously you can do that if you'd like, but I also
we don't
want
work for Activision.
But I also wanted to ask this. I mean, I think that I've spent a lot of time over the last few years working with Silicon Valley because I wrote this book about social media and its effect on history. And one of the things that I found repeatedly, even despite everything we've been through over the past 20 years, is that people in the tech space oftentimes really want to celebrate the potential good that their products will do and not always consider the potential harm that their products might cause. And again, it's sort of this commercial imperative is at the heart of that, I find sometimes. So I'm wondering in the video game industry, and particularly when it comes to these questions around World War II, Holocaust, Nazism, I mean, these are horrific things that require deep, critical, nuanced understanding. Is there something built in within the process of game development and game design that imagines the worst case scenarios, that imagines how products or new designs that are shipped can be used for harm, to cause harm, and if so, just how that's thought about in the industry and in the development of these products? And I throw that to either of you, and you can also then respond to things that Bob said as well.
Well, I'll jump in real quick. I can only speak about the games I've been involved with, and it's primarily been Medal of Honor. But though I will say, generally speaking, like I said at the top, I think games are bigger than as far as reach and size now. Games are the largest form of entertainment on the planet, and so you're going to find as a widest spectrum of different takes and different approaches, and whether they're good taste or bad taste, or if that's up for debate. As you would find that in games as much as you find in film or books or TV or any medium. So I can only talk about the Medal of Honor series, and like I mentioned, our goal is always to be authentic, not necessarily realistic. And I think Nick's points about don't purposely put dumb, inaccurate stuff in there is always a golden rule to develop by. So I think the topics you raised are incredibly important, and going all the way back to the original Medal of Honor in 1999, which shipped on the original PlayStation on a CD-ROM and ran on a old television. I always take pride in that we talked about everything from the Treaty of Versailles to the role that Britain played before the United States got involved. So we are absolutely taking an ally. We're coming at it from an allied perspective. And to be more specific, the Western, the United States, Canada, UK, and Zach. But I think with that series, we've always tried to emphasize it's an allied effort. It's the third game we made was Allied Assault. The second game we made, you played a woman, you played a member of the French Resistance, which was maybe even, if anything, ahead of its time back in 2000. So you're playing a first-person shooter as not just a woman, but a French woman in the underground. So I think again with the Medal of Honor series, we've always tried to take that approach, and we've also, because a lot of these topics are so important, and if the game is the gateway, we've always included a video gallery section, which is documentary driven. And we did it all the way back in 1999 with really, by today's standards, kind of primitive historical interstitials. But with the most recent game that we put out, we invested a lot of time and energy, creating a set of documentaries that stood outside the game to tackle these things in a way that was, I think, that the medium of being a documentary was the way to ground that presentation in a way that that was appropriate. And so we took a lot of veterans back to the places that had these impacts on their lives. We did the short film Colette, which ended up winning the Academy Award for Best Short Documentary, and those were all companion pieces. The game was the gateway to get the fun entertainment part, and then if you were interested, I want to learn a little more about this, I want to learn more about what happened, you're hearing, most importantly, from the people that were actually there, and being able to see what these places look like today, and the impact of these events that still carry forward to this day. I think that's how we address it. And again, every studio is going to approach it differently. Every game series is going to approach it differently. So I can only speak about what we did, but I think that's a way to you maybe get a teenage. I don't want to stereotype the player base, because it is incredibly. The spectrum is much broader than it was when I started out. But to stereotype for a second, grabbing that teenage boy, getting him like, here's a fun game, and then, I do want to. I am interested in this. We immediately have that content for them to dive a little deeper and give that perspective. So, it's about finding the balance and the right medium to deliver it.
Great, thank you, Nick.
I couldn't agree more with that last section. It's pretty much our attitude as well. We have various different media, either online articles or videos. I mean, if you look at the World of Warships channel, has something called Naval Legends or Naval Fortresses, and the level of quality and detail of these things, it'll put anything you'll find on the TV today to shame. And I think we look at it as one additional tasker, though, over what you mentioned there, Pete, and that is not only does it bring the history to the players in a better manner, more accurate manner than just the game alone does. It also, again, we're a company. Our job is to make money as well. It also, we find, is a method of attracting new audiences. So, by way of example, we had. They sent me off to do some researching in the National Archives. And as I'm doing digging for tanks to be implemented into World of Tanks, I come across a whole bunch of materials that has not previously been published. So they were nice enough. We did a deal with the publisher. I got a book out. And it says World of Tanks on the front, but inside it is absolutely nothing but historical archive data from, sourced from the archives. And of course, the timing on this is wonderful. And so what happens now is that this book is available. If you are interested in the subject matter and you want to learn more, you can buy the book. Or if you're interested in the subject matter, if you've never heard of the game at all, you can go to the book. You'll get all the data you want on tank destroyers. The book's called Can Openers, if I can do a shameless plug. And then when you get the book and you have the data, you might, what's this World of Tanks thing that it's associated with? And the same with the videos on YouTube. So again, it works both ways. We help feed the teaching of history, and it also works in our commercial favor by bringing new audience to us because we put out a good, historical, accurate product that people want to listen to. As far as playing the bad guy, well, everybody wants a driver Tiger tank, and I think you have to put a limit. There's some games where talking about the nuances in the larger sphere of war is probably not going to do the game or anybody else any good. And as you said at the very beginning, there are games to cater to any aspect of the war. I was looking at one recently, This War of Mine, which is set modern day, but you play a besieged civilian. You're not even given a gun. Your job is just to survive in the middle of a war. And I think you're better off, instead of looking at any one game for history, you need to get a selection that each focuses on a subset, and that way you get a better overall view.
Great, thank you. And yes, it does sound like they're doing some lawn work in the back, so our timing was impeccable. Let's spin this forward a little bit for the next 15 minutes, and then we'll get some audience questions and get a little bit more perspective on what the listeners are thinking about as we talk about these subjects. But I feel like we can't have the conversation about the past and the present without spinning it forward to the future. So as we look into the future, museums, history courses, universities, everybody in the history space is wondering where that next generation of visitors is going to come from, where the next generation of students who are taking history courses are going to come from. And I wonder if you guys see a role for video games, particularly World War II video games, but even video games more broadly, in the future of the history profession. And I want to sort of give some context to this question by pointing out, as some people are aware, that in the United States, at least over the past 10 to 15 years, history degrees have been the steepest dropping degree of any undergraduate degree awarded. They drop more than degrees in philosophy and religion, English and business, a 33% decline over the past decade in people getting undergraduate history degrees. Now, that's rebounded a little bit slightly in some places, but there are still some enormous headwinds facing history departments across the country and history majors and history degrees. History museums across the country are also facing a lot of constrained funding, and there's been sharp declines in visitorship. Of course, some of that is attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the pandemic also forced museums to lay off staff. It even forced some museums to close. So there are a lot of headwinds facing the history profession and questions around who will continue to study history and perpetuate historical information. And then we contrast that with an industry like video games, which has been mentioned here, is burgeoning. Billions of players around the world, an industry that's larger than Hollywood and film, billions of dollars being transacted in games every year. Is there a role for video games in the future of history in helping to turn the tide with some of the headwinds facing the history profession? And if so, what role do they play, and what role particularly could World War II video games play? So let me throw that question just openly and see who wants to jump in on it.
Yeah, I'm ready to talk on that. As a historian, as somebody who's in the trenches, so we might say, with historical education, I'm really eager to see scholars get involved with games, to get involved with criticizing games, and then perhaps making games. And I think it's really interesting timing here. We are now 50 years past this past December, 50 years past the development in 1971 of the original Oregon Trail game, which was created by a history high school educator for a classroom in Minnesota in 1971. And so, in a way, historians and history educators were there at the very conception of digital games as we know them. And so, I think having scholars getting involved with games would be, in some ways, kind of a return to form, and not necessarily something that's new. And certainly with the work that I do with History Respawned, I make the point over and over again that when you're talking about historical memory and the development of that memory, games are really instrumental to that. Games, I think, in a lot of ways, are the medium of the future. And I think what Peter has said, Nicholas has said, this is where the audience is. And I can think for myself, I've got two young kids, and when my daughter was 3 years old, her first kind of moment of coming across a historical character, in this case Abraham Lincoln, was in a tablet game. Right. So, it might be kind of inconvenient for scholars to think about games as being a part of historical memory, but, we're already there. And, one of the panels earlier, again, the panel on the Holocaust this morning, had wondered aloud, how do we reach students who are coming across these Holocaust sites and these museums, but they're glued to their phones. And I think games have an answer for that question.
Peter, Nick, want to weigh in?
The trick with that, I think, is going to be, are you going to use games as the teaching medium itself, or are you going to do what we're doing right now, let's say, and using it as an adjunct? Because the trick with using it as a teaching medium is, again, it's got to be fun, it's got to be interactive, and it has to have sufficient appeal that it's commercially viable to do. Yes, you mentioned Oregon Trail, but I mean, face it, how many people today are going to, 15-year-olds are going to fire up an old DOS emulator, or even older than DOS, I guess, and do a simple home-built independent game like Oregon Trail. Now, I'm not dissing on the indie studios; they do great work, but they don't have the marketing behind it. So I don't know. Maybe should a museum commission an independent studio to make a game which furthers the teaching that they want to do? Because that's a big risk, because you put all the money in and you don't know if it'll be successful. You don't know if how well people will take the lessons from it. Whereas a more traditional sort of arrangement with musea, so I mean, for example, we work very closely with the two tank museums, one in the UK, the Bombing Tank Museum, and one in Canada, the Ontario Regiment Museum, and that is a pure partnership, and it's effectively, it looks like a sponsorship, but it works because we give them a platform to all our players, and also we bring our players to them. So I think that's your first question is, how are you going to use a game? Yeah, it's all very well hand-waving, say, yes, let us use games to teach history, but how are you going to do it?
Yeah, Roger Ebert famously called movies empathy machines, and games are empathy machines, exponentially so. And like making a good movie or writing a good book or making a good TV show, making a good game is really hard, really, really hard. So I think it's who knows what the future is going to hold, but I think if you're able to use the medium of games and more broadly interactive mediums that are emerging every day to tell stories that people can empathize with, or broaden their horizons, that's a win. That's a wonderful thing. And it's never going to replace, I think what's probably considered, real scholarship or more serious, grounded discussion about these critical topics. But empathy is such an important part of getting people on that track. And again, it runs the spectrum. You have things that can be silly or dumb, or come just like, again, like any number of films or books, you're going to find the same thing with games. But if you can hook someone in and get them to empathize with the story, with very human stories, that's great, and that gets them on that track. And as technology and techniques and processes improve, as they do with games, every year, I'm excited about where we'll be 20 years from now and what you'll be able to do from an interactive standpoint to create something that will unlock that empathy in people.
All right.
I was wondering if virtual reality would do that for you.
Yes, and that's a whole other thing that we haven't even touched on, is this question about VR and XR and Metaverse, and that might have to be a panel for next year's conversation and conference. I do want to get audience questions in, and while we're getting that sorted out and get our moderator back, I also I just came up with this thought in my head, and maybe we could have a little fun together before we get the audience questions in. But it strikes me that there's so many games already out there that we talked about, but I wonder if we could each take a moment to envision one World War II game that we would love to see, and maybe one that is really, one that's different than that's out there, or that plays on some aspect of the scholarship or aspect of the history that we think would be really interesting to use as a gateway to further understanding. And the game may be out there, as you say, because there's so many games in existence. But as we've been talking, I've actually been thinking in my head about, okay, what would it look like to try to design a World War II video game where you have to try to get Jewish refugees out of Europe? And you have to go to the State Department, and you run into the anti-Semitism there, and you run into all kinds of hurdles in Europe, talking with different embassies and diplomats, and you have to navigate the war in the Atlantic, and you have to think about how you're going to get maybe Jews to Shanghai, or get them to Iran, or get them to the Philippines. And could there be a way to use a game to understand just how difficult it was to get Jewish refugees out of Europe, the anti-Semitism that was encountered across different places, and resistance that was faced by Jewish refugees? Could you maybe include the Evian conference and these nations coming together and only one volunteering to take Jewish refugees, which was the Dominican Republic, and then use that as a way to try to figure out how to get Jews from Austria or Germany to the Dominican Republic, such as was done in 1940? Just, what would it look like to put that into a video game and trying to have people learn a bit about that history? I think if that game doesn't exist, maybe that could be something that historians and game designers could work on. Bob, what do you think? What's a game that you would love to see designed with scholars and game designers that would entry people into World War II history?
Yeah, well, it's funny you bring this up because I feel like in the past few years, a lot of those games that I kind of always wanted have now been created. So some of the indie games that I mentioned, or I briefly mentioned indie games on World War II on the past 5, 10 years. One of those is a game from Paint Bucket Games. It's called Through the Darkest of Times. And this is a game in which you are playing basically as a leader of a fictionalized version of the White Rose group. So this is a group of German students in Berlin for the Paint Bucket Games who are attempting to foster a resistance to Hitler and to Nazi Germany. Another game that I'd like to call attention to is from Charles Games. This is a studio out of University of Charles, or Charles University in Prague, that has been working academics to tell the story of Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic during the war and then after the war. And so one of their great games is Svoboda 1945. That looks at the end of the Nazi regime and then the complications that come after the war, with remembering the wartime period, and then also what happens to that under the development of a communist regime in the 1940s, 1950s. And then just briefly looking forward, World War II games have always drawn inspiration from World War II cinema. And I would always be interested in a game that looked at America on the home front during the Second World War, maybe a gamified version of the film The Best Years of Our Lives. I would be interested in looking at the problems for returning veterans, post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe that wouldn't be a fun game, but as a scholar, I think that would be really useful for history education.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating. Nick, you want to take a stab at this one before we get the audience involved?
All right, I'll give it a go. And I know ahead of time that it would never sell, so it'll never be made. But the longer I have been involved in doing tank history, the more I've come to appreciate the work that was being done in the US to support the tanks. Initially, you kind of start at the point yet, oh, Tiger better than Sherman, and so on. And then you ask, why is it Sherman better? And it goes back years to decisions made years ago in the US, down to, okay, we got this amount of tungsten. Do we use it to make machine tools, or do we use it to make ammunition? Do we have a 200 division army? Do we have a 100 division army? Because we suddenly took all the farmers out, we got nobody to feed. We only have so many ships. Do we need to buy more ships so we have more tonnage capacity to send the supplies overseas? How many supplies do we send with spare parts versus new equipment? It's amazing when you look into it just how varied all these decisions were on the home front, as you were saying there, but a slightly different aspect of it. And I love strategy games anyway, grand strategy. And I think that alone would do so many wonders to changing people's perceptions of why the armies actually doing the fighting ended up looking the way that they did. And now I don't know how you would program it. I don't know who would sell it. I don't know who would buy it except for me. But that's my goal.
All right. Well, that's a good one. I would actually be interested in that. Peter, you get the last word before we bring the audience in.
Again, I can only come at it from my experience and my point of view, and I think that Jason, the ideas that you were talking about at the top, in my experience, the best way to tell those big stories is down at the individual level, and I think, finding ways to personalize those stories, and tell them from a human perspective, I think is when games can really rise to the occasion and really seize the opportunity of what they can be. So I think whenever it comes to the big, the big topics, getting it down to an individual level, it's hard, and that's the challenge. But if you can do that, that's when you can make a very personal connection.
Okay, great. Well, let me see if we can get our moderator, our host, Jeremy Collins, back in here. Oh, there he is. And we can see what the audience thinks about this. Very curious if this conversation is resonating with our listeners and what questions they may have. So, Jeremy, over to you.
Well, we've got a lot of questions, and I think we've got a good amount of time to try to get through most of them. We're going to start first with, how much interest is there in the strategic campaign planning games versus tactical first-person shooter simulations? Is there a percentage there? Is there a quality? What do you all think? Jason, do you have any breakdown of that?
I not in front of me, but perhaps our industry experts can at least give us a ballpark on some of this stuff. I'd also be interested too, just real quick to tag on to this question about the demographics. It was alluded to earlier that there is a diversity of people who play these games, and we don't want to assume that they're all white and male, but I'd be interested to see what the numbers bear out, and actually if first-person shooter games, for example, tend to lean more white and male than maybe other games, or vice versa.
Yeah, so industry experts. Peter, can we start with you on that? Do you have a balance of when you explore and do market research?
Well, and Nick's gonna, I think, have a really great perspective on this as well. Look, the game industry and the market, or the audience for games, didn't get to be as big as it is by just being exclusively white young male. I think that's been, as a game developer, one of the joys of the last couple of decades has been seeing the audience for people who play games and who make games, just as importantly, grow much more diverse. And I think it's kind of the stereotype that might be out there about a typical game player is very much a stereotype and not really reflective of what the reality is. You don't get as big and as popular without becoming a lot more diverse. And again, I think Nick's going to be able to speak a little more eloquently about tactical versus strategic. It really depends on the story you want to tell and the experience you want to share. And just the same way that if you try to put everything into one, if you try to make a game that does everything, it's going to succeed at nothing. And so I think the fact that games are parsed a little bit is not a bad thing. And the fact that you can switch between different genres within the World War II subject matter is a really great thing, and I think they complement each other as opposed to hurting each other.
I don't think there's any doubt that first-person shooters have the numbers over strategy or even Battlefield Tactical, simply because, if nothing else, you can't exactly play something like Hearts of Iron 4 on a PlayStation. A lot of the high-fidelity games require the input of a computer. What we find interesting about the demographics is our demographics vary for the same product depending on where you are geographically in the world. So our demographic in North America is substantially older. than it would be in Eastern Europe or Asia. And I'm not entirely sure why. But we have definitely noticed that you're going to get more 40 to 50-year-olds playing World of Tanks in North America than you will in Poland, for example. And there's also some cultural issues as well. So gameplay styles don't necessarily, what we've discovered is that what makes a player, what appeals to an American player doesn't necessarily appeal to a Russian player. Because just the basic mentalities that they have and what they find enjoyable. And this has proven to be quite a challenge in finding a good balance of a game that appeals to everybody. And as I say, you can't do everything for everyone, but even just at this one level of making a game, it's been an interesting balance. And the last thing is also very much depends on what your subject matter is. So America doesn't have a great tank history. Russia has a huge tank history. It's like there's a T-34 on every street corner in Russia, whereas America is the land of the P-51 Mustang or the Hornet, USS Hornet, the Essex class carrier. And so your demographic is also going to shift geographically depending on your subject. So hopefully that answers some of the question anyway.
Great. Our next question is for Peter. The last Medal of Honor game was on VR headset. Does this make war games more real?
They make them way more immersive. Per what we were all talking about earlier. I don't necessarily think it makes it more realistic. It makes it incredibly immersive. I think VR is an incredible platform for immersion, and therefore I think it does create more opportunity for empathy. If you've never put on a VR headset, I think what people don't realize, it's not just that you've got two screens close to your eyes. It's that it's combination, it's stereoscopic, so it's 3D. So your brain is processing a 3D image. But more importantly, more critically, the camera and your head are one and the same. When you're playing a game on a computer screen or an HD TV, it's a 2D image, and where you look in the world is independent of what's happening on screen. When you're in a VR headset, where you look is where the camera is pointing, and so it's incredibly immersive. So it introduces all sorts of opportunities from gameplay, from narrative, and it is a really wonderful medium. I think one of the sponsors of this conference, Oculus, now Meta. They've done a really great job continuing to push, or I should say, push the hardware to lower the barrier of entry, to remove that friction. When we started developing that last Medal of Honor game, you needed a PC, you had a cable connected to it, connected to the headset, and just since the time that we started making it to now they have a version of the headset that's wireless and a lot lighter, and so it's very exciting about where the future is going to go. I think there's always going to be space for games on screens, on mobile devices, because wherever you are, if you've got that with you, that's a great platform. So I think VR opens up just a really wonderful world of opportunity that is self-verifying. You put on a headset, you'll never forget it. So again, whether it makes it more real, it absolutely makes it more immersive, and that's arguably the critical part when it comes to a game.
Our next question I'm going to ask Bob to start with. And how would the panelists respond to the claim that the tragedy of war is lost when combat is reduced to games?
Well, I would say that, in terms of historical study, this is a problem with, giving historical lectures or, having historical movies or documentaries. So it's not just a problem, I think, for games per se, but I think, in terms of games, that there's always an interest, with, first-person shooters, with grand strategy games, to include violence, to include, these elements. And this is an expectation of the players. I think we talk a bit about, knowing your audience, and certainly for first-person shooters, the expectation of violence is there. And that can be off-putting, right? I think this goes back, of course, to something like Wolfenstein 3D, which is not a World War II game per se, but is one that is innovative on the first-person shooter genre and based on, shooting and killing Nazis, and often, fantastical Nazis who are into the occult and wearing mechanical suits, etc. But even in those kind of moments, or even in those kind of game series, there are elements that I think are useful to scholars, kind of interrogating this idea of why are World War II games so focused on the violence? What does that say about us? What does that say about the audience in North America, the developers in North America in particular? But then there's also moments that come out of those games that really push the agenda and diversify World War II depictions in video games. So, for instance, the newest iteration of the Wolfenstein series, Wolfenstein: The New Order, which came out in 2014, was, to my knowledge, the first AAA game that made a direct reference and included images from the Holocaust. So, you could say on the one hand, this kind of violence is terrible, but on the other hand, as a historian who often struggles with, Holocaust denial from many areas of public life, that's useful for me, right, to point to and be able to use.
Nick,
I think this question actually
yeah.
came up in the National World War II conference a couple of years ago, and it was the question like, at what point can we get entertainment out of a war? If you make a comedy about the war in Afghanistan, would that be acceptable? How long would it be before you could make sitcoms based around World War II? And I think Rob is absolutely right that there is it's a very flexible sort of opinion. Nobody's entirely sure where this answer is.
Peter, is that something you'd like to respond to as to how your team put the last game together, put all the games together that you've worked on?
Well, it depends on the story you want to tell, and I think I can really only speak with any bit of confidence about the Medal of Honor series, and that was a game that was created to put you in the boots of a soldier, and so it's gonna be about combat, and again it's not going to be realistic, because if you get hit by a bullet or by shrapnel or concussion from an explosion, that's going to knock you out of the war, and that doesn't make for a compelling game. Not making, I think, again, every game and every developer and every team is going to approach it differently. I think for us with the Mo series, it's never been about desensitizing or being exploitive, and I think in the most recent game, I think we did try to deconstruct a lot of the power fantasies that do exist in a lot of combat games, and we really tried to bring in a diverse set of characters. There was really only one speaking role or a couple speaking roles that were American. We had Brits, we had French, and it very much wasn't a power fantasy. People died. It wasn't a super team of superheroes. It was, young kids, old men, women stepping up and leading the charge. So I think when you look at the real stories and what really happened, you find these incredibly compelling narratives. And if you're able to translate that into an interactive environment and let the player project themselves into this world, what was interesting about VR is the first time we made a game where you weren't playing a named character, you were just referred to as Lieutenant. And so that allowed the player to put themselves in there. You could customize your hands. You could we gave you the tools to really project yourself into the game and experience an interactive version of those events. And so, and there are consequences. So again, people died, bad things happened, and we tried to tell a story that was authentic, that didn't have a feel-good ending, other than contributing to the defeat of the Third Reich. I think as the medium evolves and the tools available to us grow, and a more diverse group of people get into game development, and that's really I think one of the most critical things. That allows us to tell these more diverse stories, and I think everyone benefits from that.
Jason, do you have anything as the chair to add? Because that's a pretty broad question. Oh, Jason, you have probably muted yourself, sir. There you go.
Yeah,
Thank
I was
you.
trying to be conscientious and not rustle papers in the background, and then I had a faux pas. My 2 cents, I would say that I have great concerns about desensitization to violence and the sort of casual nature that war gets depicted. But I would say that that's not exclusive to video games. I think video games operate in a complex hybrid media environment that includes television, that includes film and cinema, that includes social media. And, sometimes I'm even just shocked by how much violence is on all of these platforms all of the time. You turn on television and it's body count after body count and people shooting and killing each other. You go to the movies and it's body count after body count. Video games, it's body count after body count. Even on social media, it's continual images of violence. On the news, it's continual images of violence. So I do have concerns about that, but it's not exclusive to video games. I have concerns about the whole ecosystem. And I think all of it is complicit, but how much each individual part is complicit and how much each individual part is learning and adapting and borrowing and being inspired by the other parts. I think these are questions that media scholars and historians and other concerned citizens, we are looking into it. We're trying to figure out and suss out what this collective media environment is doing to us and what it's doing to our understanding of history, to human rights, to understandings of violence. And I think these are big, complicated questions that extend beyond simply one medium.
Thank you. Next question is going to be from Alex M. Wants to know, how can World War II video game storytelling stay fresh for current gamers and future generations? Jason, you had asked if there was a storyline or what game would you like to see, but this is a good question as to the actual steps. What steps do we take to keep it interesting, to keep the audience coming back? If I can, we'll start with Nick, then go to Peter, and then we'll have Bob and Jason answer if they have anything to contribute.
I think to a large extent it's Peter's answer of immersion. If you go back, I will pull games off my virtual shelf and I will play them that are years and years old because they're just good games. They may not appeal to today's 20-year-old because the graphics are old and clunky, but the challenge is absolutely spot on, and oftentimes the storylines are perfectly acceptable today as well. But the difference is you have to make it more appealing for people that want to get into it and not just play the old thing. And the next step, we've seen all the greatest improved graphics, we've seen all the greatest improved sounds. Assuming we cannot improve on the storytelling, and people have been telling stories for centuries, so I don't see any great technological or any great revolutions in storytelling, then making it more immersive, making it more appealing for people to want to get into a historically based game in the first place, I think is where your answer is. So I think that's a good segue for Peter now.
Yeah, and here's the wonderful thing, that the tools available to everyone now are more powerful than they've ever been. I mean, making games, just the same way that everyone now has a movie studio in their pocket with their phone. The fact that everyone carries around cameras and has nonlinear editors, built into their phone. Anyone can. I'm generally speaking, anyone can make a movie. And really, the same is true about games. The tools, the tools that are available for free to people would seem like science fiction to me 20 years ago when I was first starting out. So I think we'll see new and fresh stories just naturally emerge because the people who have access to these tools is growing every day, and the more the perspectives that you get from growing up in a different place, in a different culture or society, that's going to inform the art you create. And if we're able to get these tools to everyone, you'll start to see those stories emerge from those creators and those developers. And I think that's a really, and not only the tools are there, the distribution networks. We've really kind of migrated to a digital world now, so you don't have to get your game into a box, into a store. There are a myriad of digital storefronts that you can publish on. So there's never been a better time to make games and to create games. And if you're interested, for young people who are coming up who are burning to tell stories from their perspective, boy, that's the tools are there now, and I think it's gonna be it's very exciting to see what's going to emerge has been emerging from these younger developers, and it's only going to get more exciting.
This next question I'm going to pitch over to Bob. I think he has a great finger on the wide pulse of video games. What theater of World War II do the most popular games focus on, and why?
Yeah, I think as we talked about previously, a lot of World War II games focus on the combat on the Western Front in France and in Germany, 1944, 1945. And that's a reflection of kind of the interest of the audience, primary audience, mostly from North America, but then also the development team. Many of the big development studios are still based in North America, in California. In particular. And, it's a really important story, I think, for the history of World War II games, as Peter could tell us about, is, the story of the kind of influence of cinema on the development of World War II games, particularly Medal of Honor, but also to a certain extent, I think, with the competitor series Call of Duty. And the many ways in which those games and other World War II games really borrowed a lot of their language and their representations from movies. I can think back to the 1990s playing World War II games like the Commando series from Eidos Studio. And they had missions in that stealth game that were taken whole cloth from famous World War II movies like, Where Eagles Dare and Bridge on the River Kwai and Force 10 from Navarro, all of these old movies. And so I think that goes a long way to, telling that kind of story as to why those games focus on that theater of World War II.
Great. Jason, do you have anything to say on the popularity of one theater versus the other?
I would just say that both of these two questions just underscore how much diversity is still needed in this whole space. I know there's a lot of diversity in terms of the players, but I think diversity in terms of the theaters of operation that are covered would be a great asset in terms of World War II memory, World War II education, and World War II gaming. I think also having diversity of experiences. So what would it be like to design a game as a Japanese American whose family is interned and you're sent off to fight? Or what would it be like to design a game where you're a black soldier who's facing racism within your unit, and then you go overseas and you're being asked to fight for the same flag that is telling you that you're not a citizen, a full citizen, back at home? I think these would be really important opportunities for learning, for diversifying historical perspectives, and diversifying the types of environments and stories that get told in these games. And I think, as Bob has pointed out already, some of this is happening, and some of these games are being developed. And how great it would be if we could get the right tools and the right resources into people's hands to do even more of this.
Yeah. And just to piggyback real quick on Jason's point, I think this is something that historians can offer to game developers, right? The most interesting stories that you can get on the Second World War are being developed by historians who are in the archives, right? The most interesting personal perspective, as Peter had talked a little bit about, getting that personal perspective, making it interesting for player, that's something you can get from scholarship. And so, I encourage my students all the time through my classes. I have them do a game development project where they are building their own text adventure games using a program called Twine. And in that program, they don't have to do any programming, but they can create compelling games with images and with audio using primary sources. And, it's been my experience that those primary sources, that archival research, that gives you the kind of interesting human level story that I think World War II games often lack.
Well, thank you both on that one. The next question is probably going to go more towards our practitioners, if you will. At what point does historical fact hinder playability and accessibility? How do you avoid glossing over? So 2 questions. We've talked a little bit about the second one, glossing over war, but I'd like you to focus more on, when the history might get in the way of something that is compelling. Nicholas, we'll start with you and finish with Peter on that, please.
I'm trying to figure out how to answer it, because I think the question it implies a level of complexity that isn't necessarily present in all games. So if you have a historically accurate game, you have to sacrifice something for the sake of playability. You can't do it. You can't spend 45 minutes of your game time, because you only have so many hours in the evening, pretending to wrench a track to make your tank more functional. So there is absolutely no choice. You have to make a sacrifice somewhere. The question is, what is your audience going to accept? Is your audience going to accept the fact that you don't have to do the maintenance? Yes, most likely. Is your audience going to accept the fact that you don't have to stop for 5 minutes to fill up with gas? Probably. Is your audience going to accept the fact that your American tank is absolutely invulnerable to German tanks for gameplay? No, they won't. So I think that really becomes a commercial decision, depending on who your target audience is, what the purpose of the game is. Is it what you call a serious game, which is actually designed primarily for education and training, or is it an entertainment game? And I think that's where you have to look at that balance focus, and game designers have been fighting with this for years.
Peter, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, it's I think Nick has hit the nail on the head, and a good comparison is film. If you watch a 2-hour film, they cut out the parts where everyone's sleeping. They cut out or people are going to the latrine. It focuses on the really compelling part of the narrative that you want to get across, and so in a linear, so that's what you see in a linear form a linear form of entertainment, like a film or a TV show. And games, it's a similar set of things where you are not trying to portray a one-to-one simulation of real life. You are trying to distill down elements that are compelling and interesting and give the player something to think about. And yeah, again, if you can create something that is entertaining in the best sense of the world, that engages people at an emotional level, at an empathetic level, boy, you've done what you set out to do. And if that then drives them or compels them to a book or a Wikipedia entry, or a documentary or a YouTube interview with someone, or again, like I said, seeking someone out who was actually there, or signing up for a history class that they weren't planning on taking. That's the goal. That's absolutely the goal.
I'm reminded of an Onion News Network article. New Call of Duty game replicates waiting for orders.
Well, thank you to our panelists. To Peter's last point, it's amazing how many younger people come through the museum whose gateway to World War II history were the early Medal of Honor and Call of Duty and other platform games. The colleagues I've played the wargaming games with. Peter, I haven't yet installed the new Medal of Honor on my VR at home. My son's too young for that, but it's amazing. And if it's in the right hands, it's great, but I understand how there's a lot of concern that it could just be fun. I want to thank Bob. I want to thank Nicholas. I want to thank Peter, and I want to thank Jason for this wonderful and non-traditional, as I mentioned earlier. This is new to us at the museum. We've talked about it a lot, but we haven't presented it. This was a great conversation, and I really am looking forward to maybe seeing how we can put something else together. I'd also like to thank the sponsor of the conference, the American Battle Monuments Commission, EA Respawn Entertainment, and I'd like to give a special shout out to Peter Hirschmann, who's been a great partner all through this process, as well as his right-hand woman, Emily Adair, who's been just wonderful and been with us like the speakers have. They stuck with us for a number of years as we tried to get this program off. So thank you very much.